Hi, everyone. We'll get started in just another minute as more people sign in. Mm.
Oh my God.
Okay, let's get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Cafe Oleh. My name is Jay Rosen. Here at Cafe Oleh with Nefesh B'Nefesh, we go over the everyday Hebrew you need here in Israel to succeed, whether that's reading and paying your bills, going grocery shopping and reading nutritional labels, keeping up with the news, striking up a conversation, flirting, dating, complaining, job interviewing, all the everyday things you do in your native language in your country of origin, but here in Israel in modern Hebrew. As always, we'd love to hear from you what topics you'd like us to cover. That's how we've been running for the last 7.5 years, turning your concerns, your questions, your challenges, and turning them into full lessons. So you can always be in touch with us by email at hebrew@nbn.org.il. That's Hebrew at nbn.org.il. If you're joining us live on Zoom, you can write to us in the chat with any questions, comments, concerns, and topic requests you may have. We leave the Q&A button specifically reserved for questions pertaining to the class we're about to start. You can also see all of our previous lessons up on YouTube. Just go to youtube.com, type in Cafe Oleh. The very first result will be a link to our playlist with currently 167 previous lessons and 28,000 views. So you can watch all of our previous lessons on demand. You can also search and see what topics we've covered, what topics we haven't covered in a while. And they are there all for you at your convenience. With that, let's get started. We have a lot of great classes coming up this summer session, including topics we've never covered before, including the one we're about to start. All of the lessons will be, as always, you can sign up for the entire summer session rather. Can't make it, all be on YouTube. And at the top of the hour, I'll tell you what next week's class is about, in addition to taking any questions you might have. One last bit of housekeeping. If this is your first time joining us or you haven't been with us for a while, like I said, the chat is reserved for your questions, comments, concerns, and topic requests. We just ask that you keep the personal conversation there to a minimum. With that, let's get started. Today's class is a request from you. We've had this request in a few different ways, both directly, the specific topic we're about to start, and indirectly in a very, very common concern that many of you learning Hebrew, whether you have immediate plans to make Aliyah to Israel, whether you've been here for a while, whatever it may be, is the issue of accents. And I've named this class without um, further ado, let's get started. So the name of this class, and we're going to use PowerPoint for this because it's a little bit easier to explain, is how to talk pretty in Hebrew, even without the resh. If you don't know what I'm alluding to in the title, there is a very talented American author named Dave Sedaris. And one of his books is entitled Me Talk Pretty One Day. And it's a collection of short stories like he normally writes. And this one is particularly about his move to France and taking French and learning French in an intensive school. And any of us been in this class who've ever formally learned a language, and particularly Hebrew, right? You're in Ulpan, you're in day school, you're in university, you're in yeshiva, you'll relate to this story. It is one of the funniest things you'll ever read. And it has to do with getting the language right, and especially in a language that is stereotypically so fixated on the accent, like French. It makes for a really funny story. So first off, highly recommend to read it. But why do I start there? Because let's face it, you and I, we are all fixated on the accent. How do we sound like a local, right? Because we associate in our minds sounding like a local means that we're going to fit in, or sounding like a local means that we're understood and we're going to have a better chance of fitting into Israeli society. And I get that concern. I get that entirely. However, and this is the part that I really want us to um, focus on, is 2 points. And I've said this before, and I will continue to say this, not just in this class, but in previous Cafe Oleh sessions and future ones too, if it'll let me. Any language, not just Hebrew, but any language, okay? Everyone has an accent, even native speakers. Everyone has an accent. And in a country that is predicated upon aliyah, like ours here in Israel, everyone has an accent. Is there a standardized sound of modern Hebrew? Yes, and we're going to talk about that in today's class. But everyone has an accent. Whether you made aliyah, whether your parents made aliyah, whether whatever the situation may be, everyone has an accent in a different way that they speak. One of the best ways I help articulate how important this is to get over that issue, I'm actually going to talk about when we get into our second point here, which is another point I say a lot when people get really fixated on an accent, right? Which is it's better to speak effectively. And when I say effectively, I mean, as I say here in parentheses, fluency plus tempo. Okay, that you have the words. You not just have the words, you know what order to put them in, you know the grammatical structure of the words, you know idiomatic expressions, you know when to break the rules, plus tempo. How do you actually use the language in a way that for some people thinks you're talking way too fast, but that's how everyone speaks, right? Better to speak effectively with the thickest non-native accent than with the thickest native accent while stumbling over every other word. I'm going to give you two examples to that. The biggest word, the biggest letter in the Hebrew language that trips up a lot of, especially native English speakers, is, as I wrote here in English in Latin letters, resh, right? Resh, the counterpart in resh, right, in the English language at least, is the letter R. I want you to take a second and I want you to pronounce the sound R. Now I want you to say out loud to someone who's learning the English language, how do you tell them to make the sound R? Go through all the different movements your mouth has to make, your mouth, your jaw, your throat, your tongue, to make the sound R. I'll give you a few seconds. You're probably still working it out, right? R is one of the rarest sounds in the world. We think it's commonplace because it's either our native language or because everyone speaks English in the world, or it seems so, right? R is the last sound a native English speaker learns to make. It's the reason why so many children, right, confuse R with W. It's the reason why we have all the jokes about Barbara Walters saying Baba Wawa, right? That R is a hard sound to make and even equally hard to explain to someone how to make. Okay. So it's perfectly all right to have an accent, and it's perfectly all right to have problems saying things that's like native speaker, but you speak fluently. And I'll give you the other example. For years, if not decades, here in Israel, on the radio, the guy who did the weather forecast at the top of the hour, every hour, had the thickest, and I mean thickest, stereotypical North American accent when he spoke in Hebrew. It was literally Boker Tov Yisrael. Wasn't even that. It was Boker Tov Yisrael. Okay. And according to the rules of modern Hebrew phonology, which is the study of the sounds a language makes, that's completely wrong. And yet he was tasked by national radio to give the weather forecast. And he did it fluently without any stops. He said all the right meteorological words to get you prepared for the day and the week ahead. And he had the thickest accent. Okay. Better to speak effectively with the thickest non native accent than with the thickest native accent saying resh and everything else. And you can't string together one sentence. Okay. That being said, we're going to talk about how did modern Hebrew come to sound the way it does, and how can we understand how to pronounce it as close as possible to a native accent. More importantly, how to be understood. Okay, so some of this we've talked about before, but it's worth repeating. Why in modern Hebrew does it seem like we have letters that sound exactly the same? Well, first off, many languages have homophones, meaning words that sound the same but are written differently. Hebrew pronunciation has changed the longer that Jews were in diaspora. Initially, every Hebrew letter in the Hebrew alphabet had a different sound. Over the course of history, not just diaspora, but in the way any language naturally evolves, that started to change. And here's a great example. The letter tet in modern Hebrew, okay, in Hebrew that was spoken for centuries by Jews in the Iberian Peninsula, in North Africa, in the Middle East, sounded like tet, tet. It was an implosive T sound rather than the sound we know from English and modern day Hebrew. Tet, it was tet. Whereas in other communities, right, the letter taf without a dot in the middle, the dot called dagesh, was pronounced th, as in thav. And those of you who come from an Ashkenazi background, meaning Central and Eastern European backgrounds, you know that a taf without a dot in it is pronounced like sav for many years. Okay, those were specific to those communities in diaspora. In modern Hebrew, we've standardized it, and they all sound the same. Tet, tav. Doesn't matter which letter, and it doesn't matter if there's a dagesh in the daf or not. You can't swap them. And we've talked about that before. Spelling in Hebrew is destiny. You cannot swap letters just because they sound alike, because they also have their own 4,000, 5,000-year-old history. You can't just swap letters just because they sound alike in modern Hebrew. Okay? All of this had to happen, right? How do you standardize a language that was not used in everyday life, that was used in Jewish communities around the world that could read the same thing but didn't pronounce it the same way because they all had different traditions of how to pronounce it. And so, starting in the late 19th century with figures like Eliezer ben Yehuda, who tried to revive and were successful, the only time in human history a language was revived into everyday use, right? How do we create a uniform pronunciation, which is like we talked about before, is the word phonology, with all the different expressions, right? How do we get people who pronounce stav and thav to work together? How do we get people to pronounce plet if that's not a sound that's in their otherwise used language, right? So they had to answer some questions. What phonology, what system of pronunciation is closest to ancient Hebrew? How do we get as close as possible to our roots? What's the easiest and most pleasant to hear and pronounce? And what will be the easiest to learn? We often forget that, right? We forget, as challenging as it may be for some of us, cultural baggage as well as cognitive issues to learn a new language, right? How did you do that in such a rapid fashion at the turn of the 20th century and in those 50 years, including in through the foundation of the state of Israel? How do you get people to learn a language so fast when they weren't speaking it on an everyday basis and they were speaking in different dialects or in different pronunciation, right? And so a lot of compromise was made. One of the biggest compromises, and we've talked about this before, is pronunciation, right? One of the other things which is on the right-hand side is the word order of sentences. Traditionally, Hebrew, like other Semitic languages, if you read the Torah or any biblical era Hebrew, you know that a sentence order, right, is verb, subject, object. In modern Hebrew, it's much more fluid, and we usually do subject, verb to object, which is much closer to Indo-European languages. But we're talking about phonology today. And Eliezer ben Yehuda and his contemporaries were very much influenced by the Sephardi community who was living in 19th century Jerusalem and how they spoke the language. And a lot of how we speak today is influenced by that community, which was living there for some time. And so we have separate sounds according to standardized Hebrew for the letters Vav, Chet, Tet, Ein, Kuf. We're going to talk about those as we go through individual letters. But if you were to pronounce them the way that at that time they did, it would sound like this. Wow, het, tet, ein, puff. Do you hear that very often? No. And we're going to talk a little bit about that in a while. Okay? As well as an equally important difference in modern Hebrew is not just individual letters, but the whole sound of a word. The default syllable became the last syllable, what we call milra, as opposed to the second to last syllable, milel. Okay, so milra became the main emphasis, the default emphasis in Hebrew. Let's move on to actually starting to. Okay, how to pronounce modern Hebrew in order to communicate effectively with native speakers, letter by letter. We're not going to go through every letter, right? Because this isn't about reading Hebrew. This is about speaking Hebrew. And like I said, look at how I wrote this also. This is about pronouncing modern Hebrew in order to communicate effectively. This is not to sound like a native speaker, okay? I'm going to teach you how to make some of those sounds. But this is about to be understood effectively. And there are some that are going to be some uncomfortable truths for some people here, but they're all important. Okay, let's get started. Like I said, if you have questions along the way, you can write them in the Q&A. I'll stop, towards the top of the hour, both to take questions and tell you about next week's class. Let's get started with the very first letter, Aleph. Okay, Aleph is an actual consonant. It may not sound like it because we don't have a comparable sound in the English language, or more specifically, we don't have a letter that is the same thing as the letter Aleph. Aleph is a pause when it's in a stressed syllable. Do you hear that? I'm not, it's not deep in the back, it's just a pause. I'm cutting off the air to my vocal cords, right? That is what Aleph sounds like on its own. And it's elided, meaning that it sort of mushes in when it's in an unstressed syllable. Let me give you an example, excuse me. In modern Hebrew, first off, you see the sample sentence here, right? In modern Hebrew, we don't use those dots and bars that indicate vowel sounds, which we call nikud, right? Those are put in to help us understand how to pronounce a word and understand its meaning. In this case, we need it, even though there's context here, because we have two words here. Okay, they're spelled exactly alike. In context, I can tell you this without a doubt. In context, I know how to pronounce both of these without the dots and bars, and you'll learn that as well in just a second. Okay, because one of these is a verb and the other one is a noun. Okay. This sentence it translates to he eats the food. And when you're learning Hebrew, it's going to be confusing when you read both words um, are written exactly alike. So we think we pronounce them exactly alike. Incorrect. Listen to how I pronounce this sentence. Hu ochel et haochel. Hu ochel et haochel. Okay. What's the difference in these two words? Ochel is the verb. He eats. Ochel. Okay. Ochel goes up at the end, right? That's that milra we talked about, where the default is on the last syllable. Listen to that word again. Ochel. That oh at the beginning. You may not hear it, but your vocal cords will make it, right? Because there is no sound before the O, right? American English speakers, other forms of English, other countries, right? They may put something before that because you can't just have a vowel hanging out there. And it's true, you can't, right? Try to make the sound oh, oh. There's an initial gap blast of air before the oh sound is made, the vowel that we call oh. It's actually oh, that initial blast of air, that's the aleph, right? It's the thing right before we make that sound. Okay? Hu ochel, and the last word is the word for food, noun, ochel, right? Hu ochel et ochel. Right? That's the difference between ochel, ochel, right? In the second one, it's there, but it's not nearly as defined because first off, it's preceded by the definite article ha. So it can also sort of mush in. Hu ochel et ochel. Even listen to what I say, et ochel. Even the hay gets elided, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Okay, so even without those two, even without these nikud, and yes, people are going to come at me in the comments. Well, Jay, when I learned Hebrew and I learned biblical Hebrew, and I learned the difference between two dots under a letter versus three dots, I'm going to tell you something very honest here. Good for you. In modern Hebrew, it doesn't matter. We don't make nearly as much of a difference between these two. I can understand the difference in how to pronounce these two words simply by context. The verb is always going to be stressed on the last syllable here, and the noun, because which derives from the verb, is going to be on the penultimate, right? That's the difference between the two. Speaking of vowels, some extra tough love here. Vowel sound and length, a really important distinction in wanting to sound like a local. Modern Hebrew only has 5 vowels and 2 diphthongs. A, E, I, O, U. That's it. A, I, O, U. Okay? And we have 2 diphthongs where we take 2 of these vowel sounds and we put them together. We have A and we have I. That's it. A, I, O, U, I. Okay? That are native to modern Hebrew. Yes, we have some other sounds. There is an ow, but that's largely from loan words. Why do I bring this up? First off, whether they're short or long, right? Whether it's or ah, right? Short or long simply means how long do we hold that sound. It really depends on whether they're connected to the letters that we historically use to identify a vowel. Aleph, Hey, Vav, Yud. In Hebrew, we call these imot kriya. Okay? Again, biblical Hebrew, ancient Hebrew, there are no dots and bars to indicate vowel sounds. That was a later invention to preserve how we use the language. But you open up a Torah, there are no dots and bars. Okay? We use these 4 letters to indicate vowel sounds or the place of them, especially when it was a long vowel, but especially if we want to make sounds like ah, I, O, U. They all had to be written oftentimes using these letters to fill in those gaps. Okay. And now we get to a word that shouldn't be as controversial as it is. And I say that sorry, not sorry to my to all those joining us from the United Kingdom on this call. This is where I live. This is the second largest city in Israel. And the name of this city is Tel Aviv. That yud indicates a long vowel, folks. Okay. Tel Aviv. It is a long vowel. The emphasis is on that syllable. It is Tel Aviv. Obviously, you're not going to say it like that, but it is Tel Aviv. It is not a short vowel at the end of this word. Not. And I will speak with lots of experience here. I know lots of very, very fluent Hebrew speakers who are originally from the UK. And what makes the difference is not just their grasp on the Hebrew grammar and vocabulary and all that. They pronounce the E. They don't pronounce it I. It is not with an I, it's an E sound. When you see these four letters and that they're taking the place of a vowel sound, like in the word Tel Aviv, you know it's a long sound and it needs to be pronounced as such. That's a game change. That's a game breaker, right? A lot of things I'll slide with. This is not one of them, right? And this is one for my fellow Americans. As you can hear from my accent, I'm originally from the United States. No matter the length, if it's E or E, okay, or oo or oo, no matter the length, avoid adding extra sounds to a vowel that is otherwise common in certain forms of English. How do you answer the phone in Hebrew versus how do you answer the phone elsewhere? Let's stay with the word Hello. In American English, you will hear various forms of it, but a lot of them will have extra sounds that are connected to maybe the E, but definitely the O, right? Hello. What's that last sound in the word hello? That's a W. That's not an O. Hello. Okay? In Hebrew, all those vowels get shortened in the sense of we're not adding any extra sounds. Hello, right? Immediately use it doesn't sound like a native English speaker, right? Hello, right? Hebrew, like many other languages around the world, don't add all those other sounds that we often do in forms of English. That's a very easy way to start sounding local, is to simply reduce the amount of extra sounds you're adding, perhaps naturally, perhaps instinctively, to vowels, right? Hello versus hello. Okay? A native Hebrew speaker would say hello. But it's the same idea, right? Short. One of the easiest ways to start sounding like a local is just restricting the amount that your mouth opens. I'm going to send you, because we probably won't have time to watch it, a great music video by a very talented Israeli singer, musician, writer named Victoria Chana. And she has a great clip where she incorporates a piyut, a religious poem, into explaining how you move your mouth when you're saying the different sounds of the Hebrew alphabet. And this is a great review of that, how much you open your mouth versus how many things you add to it. It's very easy to start sounding like a local by simply restricting how wide your mouth opens when you're speaking. Let's start getting into letters. We did Aleph, now we're doing Bet. Bet is a very straightforward sound. B, 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 or B, V, V. And we'll talk about why it is in just a second. In other languages, those two sounds, because they're so close together in the way our mouths operate in order to create sounds, are often mushed together. So you'll get a letter that sounds like it's right between the letter B and V, or those sounds rather, B and V. In Hebrew, we acknowledge that and we separate them out, whether it has a dagesh, a dot, in the middle or not. Now, in everyday Hebrew, oftentimes it's not going to be written out, the actual dot in the middle, to indicate if it's pronounced bet or vet. And so we have our own rule for that, and it's called beged kefet. This is complicated. Feel free to have your eyes glaze over when you read the following thing. I'll try to dumb it down as much as I can. Beged Kefet is named after 6 letters in Hebrew that take a dagesh, that dot in the middle, and that changes the sound. Okay? Best way to understand these words, this rule is if a word begins with any 6 of these letters, it is spelled and thus pronounced with the dot in the middle. For example, the word bite. Okay? Bite has the letter bet and it has a dagesh at the beginning because it's the beginning of the word. In this sentence, right? Ani poteach sefer shel filosofia. It's ani poteach. Poteach because that's one of the 6 letters of Beged Kefed, therefore gets the dot. Therefore, a fe turns into a pe. Why does philosophia that begins with the same letter not take it? It does not apply to non-Hebrew words. Okay, it's the reason why it's falafel and not pelafel. Okay, that's the easiest way to explain it. You're going to get a copy of this spreadsheet. We have other letters, obviously, to get to. I'll let you read this on your own. Gimel. Okay, Gimel is one I know very well, and you're about to find out why. Gimel is pronounced like the American English hard G, like in get. Okay. When an apostrophe is written with it, right after the letter, primarily in loan words, it's pronounced like what we call the hard J. Okay. A hard J is as in my name, J. And this is in fact how you spell my name in Hebrew. Gimel, what we call geresh, or the slang term for that apostrophe is chupchik, yud, yud. Okay. That's how you spell my name in modern Hebrew, J. It's obviously not Hebrew in origin, hence it has that gimel with the gerish to indicate it's not g, it's j. Trust me, we've gone down that road before. Old joke. You can figure that one out for yourself. Okay, this is one that's going to be a subtle but important difference, and I'm going to try to illustrate it and get as close to the camera as I can without scaring anyone too much or showing what dental issues I may or may not have. Okay, as I wrote here, you want to pronounce this letter just like you would in American English, the letter D, dalet, dalet. But listen and watch, more importantly, how I make this sound. The normal way we make this sound, duh, duh, pronounce, do it yourself, right? Say duh, duh, duh. Your tongue, more specifically, the tip of your tongue is flattened and it hits just behind your front teeth, okay? Like that. When you're going to say daled, try to narrow the tip of your tongue so it's not flat anymore. It's just a little bit more pointed as much as you can while still making that same sound, right? Watch the difference in my tongue. Daled, which is the way you would say it according to American English. Daled, daled, daled. It's pointed, and thus it constricts both your vocal cords and your jaw and the air coming out in a different way. Dalet. Just as I said before about vowels being more by narrowing your mouth to have your vowels a little bit more narrowed and not adding all those extra sounds. Same thing with dalet. It sounds very different. It forces your mouth and your vocal cords to say the rest of that word in a different way than saying dalet. Dalet sounds a little bit more flat. Dalet sounds a little bit more pointed. Okay, practice it. Pointy a little bit more than normal. It doesn't have to be super sharp, but just pointier when you're hitting right behind your front teeth when pronouncing that sound. Okay. Okay. Hey. Hey is pronounced like the American English hey, not the American English hey, the American English letter H. Okay. Hotel, hobby, anything like that, right? It is not a raspy H, nor is it silent. It is ha. However, and this is an important one, there's the difference between standardized pronunciation and what people actually do, right? And we're going to get that in a couple letters coming up. At the beginning and middle of words, it can often be elided, meaning you're not going to hear it, right? For example, hu ochel et haochel, right? Hu ochel et haochel. We had that sentence at the beginning, right? I'm not saying hu ochel et haochel. And that is a guaranteed way to understand someone who is learning Hebrew versus someone who's speaking on a regular basis. I'm not stopping to pronounce every single letter. If I do, I got to be really fluent or I'm learning the language because a native speaker in everyday language is going to elide, mush it all together, slide it all together to say, u ochel et ochel. Even if I slow down at the beginning, that et ochel, right? All you're hearing of the hey is that ah. I'm not saying ha, I'm saying ah. Okay? It mushes together. Okay? And then finally, this letter hey is almost 95% of the time, silent at the end of the words. The only time it's not is when it has a mapik. A mapik is okay if you don't know what that is, because it looks like and often gets confused with our previous friend, the dagesh. A mapik is simply a dot in the middle of a letter that indicates you got to pronounce it. With a letter like hey, with a letter like aleph and vav and yud. Remember those placeholder letters for vowel sounds? This is another one. So in the word gavoha, tall, right? That hey is actually pronounced. Even if you say gavoa and you doesn't sound like you're saying hey, if you were to write it out in full nikud with all the dots and bars to indicate sounds, there would be a dot in the middle of the hey because that is part of the word. Okay, but otherwise, 95% of the time, you're not going to pronounce the hey at the end of a word. Shana, Shana Tova, we're going to say in a few months from now, right? Totally silent. This is a doozy of a letter. Looks simple, right? It's one straight line, pretty simple, right? Not really. So let me be both the bearer of that news, but also talk you through it. This letter, Vav, has three different sounds. V, U, O. V, U, O. The first two sounds almost always refer to its use as a prefix meaning and, which I'm going to share with you in a bit. We've talked about this before, but I added it as review, right? V and U are almost always going to be sounds that you hear at the beginning of a word indicating and. When this letter is doubled, however, and remember in that word, hu ochel et ochel, right? We're using that letter twice, both as hu, in this case, it's in the middle of the word, so it is that u sound, and in ochel and ochel, right? O sounds. When you double it, meaning you spell it with two, it's used in loan words for the sound equivalent to the American English wa, wa, as in Washington, where I'm originally from, right? Washington. That's how you're going to write Washington. Now, it's true that this letter is still pronounced by many as wa, right? And by many Jews from North Africa and the Middle East, they pronounce this letter as wow. You'll also see this spelled out as W-A-W. And there are people still to this day who do it. In standardized Hebrew, however, it's the. When it's a vowel, it's either u or o. Remember, this is one of those four letters that takes a vowel's place. I'm going to share with you the next screenshot. You don't need to go over it now. I don't think we're going to even have time to go over it now. We've talked about a vav at the beginning of the word and how we pronounce it in the context of grammar. Right now, we're only talking about phonology, how the letters sound and vowels, but I'm including this here just for the full review, right? What we call vav achibur, which is when vav is used as the prefix meaning and, how is it pronounced? Because it does change. Is it v, u, the, or all sorts of other things, right? Because you see at the bottom of the screen, we have several different ways to pronounce it. It can be ve, it can be u, it can be va, and it can be v. Okay, I leave you to this to read on your own when you get a copy of this, along with a copy of this recording. This letter. This letter has a name that in modern Hebrew is not as, how shall we say, wholesome as its original meaning. Its original meaning meant a weapon. It still does in many ways, but in modern Hebrew, it also refers to a part of male anatomy. However, regardless of what it means, it is pronounced like the American English z, z, z. Okay. And when you add an apostrophe after it, it turns into a soft J. So as opposed to my name, J, which is a hard J, you have the soft J as in Jabotinsky, right? Remember, Jabotinsky didn't come from a place where they said Jabotinsky. They came from a country and a region of languages that have the equivalent in English of ZH, je, je. Think of French, how that sounds, but also think Ukrainian, Russian, Slavic languages, Jabotinsky, right? And to this day, when you see a street named after Jabotinsky, it's written like this, not with the gimel, because it's Jabotinsky. Okay, these two letters. These two letters often are really hard for people to get. And on the one hand, I get it. I think of these as a linguistic term called shibboleth. Shibboleth, of course, is coming from the Hebrew shibolet. Shibolet is the name of an ear of grain. It was just Chag HaKatzil, the holiday of Shavuot, where we start reaping the various grains that are grown in the land of Israel. And Shibolet comes from a story in Sefer HaShoftim, in the book of Judges, where some imposters were sussed out by how they pronounced the letter Shin. And they couldn't say Shin, they could only say Sin. So when they said Shibolet, they ended up saying Sibolet, and they were understood to be infiltrators and were dealt with accordingly. Okay, this sound often people use as that, right? Guess what? The jig is up. Whether you're Jewish or not, a Hebrew speaker or not, you're going to have to master this sound. This sound is either chet or chaf. Those are the two letters in modern Hebrew that have the exact same sound, right? In modern Hebrew, this letter can be pronounced both as ch, like I just said, or it can be pronounced like the Spanish letter jota, het, het. Het or het. This is one of the classic sounds that many Jews who come from Middle Eastern, North African backgrounds have tried to preserve and have done so successfully in that in modern standardized Hebrew, it has two variations, het and het. Okay, raspy in the back if you can't pronounce the ch. However, in everyday life, you're going to hear mostly het, right? So there is a significant difference. Obviously, there's a difference in spelling, but otherwise, for the vast majority of us, it's going to be chet and chaf, the exact same thing. Okay, chet and chaf. If you can't do the ch, I'm not telling you to do the ha, right? But if you can't do ch, here's a practice that I think helps. Tilt your head back and pretend you're gargling with something in your mouthwash, whatever floats your boat, right? Pretend you're gargling right now. Okay. Now slowly bring your head forward like you're going to talk to someone, like you're looking directly at someone, and keep that sound going. That's as close to teaching you how to make that sound without, obviously getting inside you and doing it. Okay. Try gargling. It's the back of your tongue rubbing up against the back of your mouth. And by the back of your mouth, the roof of your mouth, all the way in the back. Okay? Chet, chaf, chet, chaf. Important sounds. Okay, we talked about these at the beginning of class. We're going to do this again. Tet and taf in modern Hebrew are pronounced exactly the same. Te, 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 te. The only difference is when we want to transliterate loan words from another language. Taf, the second one up here, if it takes a gerish, that apostrophe, it can turn into the American English soft th, 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 th. Okay, so tet, taf, and taf, gerish, tav, tav. Okay, just like dalet, I want you to pronounce this letter like the American English letter l, l, but I want you to keep your tongue tipped and pointed again and not flattened because we often say, and at least in American English, L, L. You see how flat my tongue is against my front teeth? L, L, L. I want you to point it as you're doing that instead. La, 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 lamed, lamed, lamed. Okay? By doing that, lamed, you are again constricting your mouth and forcing you to ensure you don't have other sounds going on, and it keeps it a little bit sharper, both your tongue and the sound. Same thing with the letter nun. We've talked about this letter before. It's a very pesky letter grammatically. But when we're speaking, again, think of how you practice right now saying the letter N, N, and instead of flattening your tongue, again, keep it as pointed as you can. nun, nun, nun. It also helps to constrict your mouth as you're saying it, nun, nun, because it then also forces your tongue to be a little bit more pointed. Okay. These two letters, right? Samech and sin. And the second letter is both sin and shin, right? You'll have to learn through context. Both the letters samech and sin have the exact same vowel sound. Excuse me, have the exact same sound. S, like in American English, S. Okay. When the dagesh, if there's a dagesh written at all, and again, in everyday Hebrew, it won't be written there, but should there be one, it'll be on the left-hand side to indicate S. If it's not there, or if it's indicated on the right-hand side, it's almost always going to be sh. You should almost always think of this letter shin as sh. It's almost always going to be sh. There are plenty of exceptions to that, of course, but usually when you're guessing, it's going to be sh. Okay. This letter, along with het, or chet as we standardized pronounce it, this is the other very controversial letter. In modern Hebrew, you get away with a lot. In modern Hebrew, this letter is treated like the letter aleph. It's a pause when it's in a stressed syllable, elided when it's in an unstressed syllable. It's the exact same thing. Hu mashen sigaria. Okay? He smokes a cigarette. Um, Achshav ani melamed. I'm teaching now. Okay. The other pronunciation, which is also standardized but seldom used, at least by the mainstream, is ein. Ein. It sounds like Arabic because it's the same Semitic language, same Semitic family, using the same sounds, right? And so many Jews coming from North Africa and the Middle East will pronounce it back in the throat. The way I best can translate or teach how to pronounce it is make like you're quickly swallowing something large. Ein, ein. Your mouth is not large because you're not actually swallowing it, right? But your throat is working and making a sound emitted from it as if you are. Ein. Okay, if you can't pronounce it, treat it like aleph and you're fine. Or it simply elides with whatever is around it. Okay. As you see, I'm not going through every letter. If I don't go through that letter, it means that it doesn't deviate in any way you need to figure out. We went through beged kefet, remember? So I didn't include the letter pe here, for example, because pe, pe, those two sounds are exactly the same in Hebrew as they are in many languages, and we talked about the rule of the dagesh in the middle. Another letter that takes a girish. Tsadi. Tsadi sounds like the American English s, st. If you want to spell it as TZ or TZ, that's up to you. TS, st, st. Right? When it's followed, however, by an apostrophe, a girish, it turns into the American English ch, ch. Okay? S when it's regular, ch when it has that dagesh on it, that girish, excuse me. Right? And now we get to, I think, the root of most of our anxieties about speaking Hebrew, especially for native English speakers, is this letter. Again, remember what I began at the beginning of this class about? Practice explaining to someone how to make the American English sound R. It is a very difficult thing to do because you have to do multiple things at once that you're not even thinking of because you've been practicing for so long, you don't remember how you learned it. Okay? And it's the reason why it's one of the very last sounds a child learns to make when they're learning English natively. It's a very difficult word for anyone to learn because statistically in the world's languages, this is one of the rarest sounds ever. Even though English is one of the most popular sounds, by language, there are very few languages with this sound, er. And when it came to this letter, in the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th, there was obviously quite a kerfluffle how to pronounce this sound because you had some communities that were saying it like the French and German r, right? A softer form of that gurgling we do for a ch, a very similar process and movement with our tongue in relation to where it is in our mouth, but a very softer sound, r. There were some people who would trill it, right? Trill is that r. r, and that was easier for them. And then, of course, us native English speakers who are used to r or r. Okay. And so what we have in Hebrew is, again, a tie. You can either pronounce it as rish or you can pronounce it as resh. If you can't do either of those, guess what? It is perfectly all right. Okay. Don't confuse someone mimicking your accent to being an insult. Don't confuse a stupid person mimicking your accent as the be all end all of how all native Hebrew speakers think. Some people are just jerks, plain and simple. If someone makes fun of you, it's their problem, not yours, right? Again, better that you have the thickest of accents and you're speaking fluently rather than focusing on this one letter. This one letter. If you can't say resh and you can't say resh, it is perfectly all right to say resh. It is even in Hebrew slang to say beseder. Okay? Are they making fun of you? It's playful humor. Take it like that and keep speaking as fluently and as quickly as you can to sound like a local. All those other things you can easily do. If you can't do resh, it is not the end of the world. Okay. If you want to practice, like I wrote here, try gargling with the back of your tongue, rubbing up against the far back of your mouth, as opposed to ch, which is a little bit more forward. This is all the way in the back, your uvula, that thing that sticks down from the back of your mouth. Okay. Resh, resh. If you can't say it, it's okay. I say resh like this after many years feeling very insecure about it. And people to this day either ask, am I French or am I sick? That's their problem, not mine, because I'm understood completely. And if someone wants to have a conversation of, yesh lecha mivtah. Oh, you have an accent. Me'efu ata? Where are you from? I'll tell them where I'm from. And I'm going to keep speaking in Hebrew, whether they stopped or not. That's their problem, not mine. I'm teaching you in this class and in our whole session in the last 7.5 years how to speak and communicate more specifically, effectively as an Israeli on the ground, whether you were born here or not. This letter is not going to be the end all of your communications abilities in Hebrew. Resh, resh, or simply resh if you can't say it. Okay. With that, I'm going to take some questions. Before I get to questions, because we're almost at the top of the hour, first off, Toda Rabah, thank you all for joining. We are currently at 367 participants. We still remain the world's largest regularly scheduled Hebrew class, and that is really saying something, not just in 2025, but in general. How many people are eager to not only learn the language, but learn how to use it in the modern state of Israel? So, Toda Rabah, thank you all so much for joining, and Kol HaKavod. Really amazing effort. Next week's class, same time, same place here on Zoom. We are going to be talking about and learning the words that you need for traveling abroad as an Israeli. It's one thing to travel to Israel. It's one thing to travel within Israel. What do you do now that you're living here? And now you're traveling abroad as an Israeli. How do I navigate everything from buying a ticket, buying the very important travel and health insurance, how to stay updated, how to get a phone plan, all the everyday things we take for granted in our native language traveling abroad, but now we're Israeli citizens. A lot of other things go into account when we travel abroad. And trust me, war and no war, Israelis love traveling abroad. So how do you navigate that? That's next week's class. Let me get to some Q&A. How can anyone know what ancient Hebrew sounded like when there are no audio recorders then? Great question. We know plenty because Hebrew is connected to Judaism and Jewish tradition is an oral tradition. So we have a lot of ways to understand how we spoke based on how various communities speak. There are some great, great articles online about how did they know, right, when they started creating Nikud, what word got what and what the sounds were all based on oral tradition. There's a reason why we talk about oral tradition. In Hebrew, also, Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral Torah, the commentary that was passed along with Torah Shebichtav, the written Torah. Great question. Okay. Um, With names when there is no in Nikud, will this pronounce with future generations when reading the names? That's a great question. So because we don't have although it's a really ironic thing, there's a phonetic sound called schwa, right? Schwa is usually written as an upside down E in phonetics, and it comes from the Hebrew vowel shva, which is traditionally silent, and sometimes it just has that little bit of a sound, and that sound turned into many languages, English included, as okay? So that is all to say, for example, if you want to say the current name of the um, uh, American ambassador to the state of Israel, I haven't seen how he's sending his name out, and it hasn't been standardized because, again, there is no standardized form of transliteration. We have a whole previous class on that. But pronounced based on how his name is pronounced in general and how it would translate into Hebrew, it would sound something like Hakabi, right? Hakabi, right? There's probably at least one aleph in there, maybe even two. Hakabi, or it could be Hakabi, or it could be Hakabi. Probably it's Hakabi, meaning hey aleph kuf. But again, we don't have standardized forms of transliteration from other languages into Hebrew. Great question. This is a question that's been burning me for years beyond Sfaradi and Ashkenazi. Are there regional socioeconomic differences in how Hebrew is spoken within Israel? Jerusalem versus Tel Aviv, Galil versus Eilat. Great question. Short answer, no. Longer answer is different communities have different words. It's less about pronunciation as it is about syntax, vocabulary. And we talk about slang a lot in Cafe Oleh, and there are major sources that come from specific groups. So, for example, because the vast majority of Jews come from the Middle East and North Africa, who make up Israel's Jewish population, plus 20% of the population are Arabic, are native Arabic speakers, plus the region in which we live. All of our slang is from Arabic. We also have slang from other languages, particularly Jewish languages or from Jewish communities. So that also is a difference in both pronunciation, but also slang. That's all to say you don't have huge differences. It's not like a regional dialect difference between, parts of the United Kingdom or the United States. Sometimes there's words. There are some classic words that are only said in Jerusalem and not anywhere else in the country, but you won't be lack of understand. There won't be any lack of understanding. Right? Um, Please help with two vavs in chavaya. Great question. We're running out of time here, but chavaya, because the root of it is chet vav hey. And in order to pronounce it, that vav as part of the word and not as a vowel, we add that second vav there to ensure that we're saying chavaya. Great question. Okay. The letter is sadi, sadi. Okay. Um, will you be discussing how to hear these sounds when someone else is speaking? Um, I am happy to give you, there's another great clip that we've shown in the past about Hebrew spelling and speaking. I'll send along with the clip I told you about, along with our presentation, but great question. How do you get your slides? Simple. You're registered here. You will get a link to this presentation. And if you don't get it from here, YouTube. Click in the description. You'll be able to see it there. Okay, we are literally out of time here. So again, toda rabah, thank you all for joining. If I didn't get to your question, if you have more questions, you can email us, hebrew@nbn.org.il. And I will hope to see you all next week for our next class. And until then, enjoy. This recording will go up on YouTube in the next day or two. You'll also get a copy of that spreadsheet we went through and the two clips I told you about. Until then, litrot.